Before there was bread on your table, there was a formula God gave to a prophet under siege. Exact grains, exact weights, exact measures, written down so precisely that a modern bakery still follows it today. And buried inside that formula is something food scientists only rediscovered a few years ago, something your doctor has never once mentioned. Subscribe now, and while you watch, guess which number this is. Drop your guess in the comments before you get there, because almost nobody gets it right. That is not even the strangest thing on this list. Somewhere ahead is a bread eaten raw dough and cooked in under 20 minutes, because there was no time to let it rise. And a grain so common in the fields outside Bethlehem that a foreign widow with nothing could glean it by hand and still feed 2 people through a famine. Your grandmother may not have gleaned barley in Judea, but if she grew up somewhere bread was still made by hand, she knew what real grain does for a body that modern flour does not. Stay for number 4, because the bread passed around most churches on a Sunday morning is not the bread the disciples actually broke. And number 1 is not a loaf at all. It is a formula, exact proportions that a prophet was commanded to eat as a sign in front of his own nation, and it may be the most complete protein source in Scripture. Let's get into it.
Number 10. Millet, the smallest grain named in the Bible, and the one almost everyone skips past without a second thought. Here is a detail buried in Ezekiel chapter 4 verse 9 that most readers walk right past. When God tells the prophet to make bread from a mixture of grains as a sign to Israel, millet is listed right alongside wheat and barley, not as filler, but as one of 6 named ingredients in the only fully specified bread recipe in the entire Bible. Millet was not a poor substitute, it was a deliberate inclusion. Ancient farmers valued it because it grew where wheat could not, in poor dry soil, in short growing seasons, in conditions that would have left a family with nothing if they had only planted wheat.
Modern science eventually caught up to what that inclusion was already doing. A 2021 review in the journal Nutrients found that millet is naturally gluten-free and carries a lower glycemic index than wheat, meaning it releases sugar into the blood more slowly. Researchers identified high concentrations of magnesium and a compound called ferulic acid, an antioxidant linked in laboratory studies to reduced inflammation. Millet also delivers more iron per serving than most modern wheat flour, once you account for the refining process that strips it away. To use it, buy whole hulled millet, not the pre-ground flour, which loses its oils fast. Toast a half cup dry in a pan for 3 minutes until it smells nutty. Then simmer it in 1.5 cups of water for 18 minutes with the lid on. Do not lift the lid early. Trapped steam is what finishes the grain evenly. Eat it the way it was eaten in Ezekiel's kitchen, folded into bread dough or served plain beside vegetables and oil. A grain valuable enough to be commanded by name in Scripture, and today it sits in the birdseed aisle instead of your pantry. Number 9. Spelt, the wheat that survived a plague, nothing else could. Most people assume spelt is just an old-fashioned version of wheat, a health food store gimmick. Open Exodus chapter 9 verse 32 and you find something specific.
During the plague of hail in Egypt, Scripture records that the wheat and the spelt were not struck because they ripened later than other grains. That single agricultural detail, tucked into a story about judgment, is a precise botanical fact about spelt's growing cycle that modern agronomists still confirm. Spelt has a tougher outer hull than modern wheat, which protects the kernel from pests, weather, and processing damage until the moment it is milled. A study published in the Journal of Cereal Science found that spelt contains higher levels of soluble fiber and a more favorable amino acid profile than common bread wheat, including more lysine, an amino acid modern wheat is often deficient in.
Because spelt has not been hybridized as aggressively as commercial wheat over the last century, some people who react poorly to modern bread tolerate spelt without the same digestive distress, though researchers are clear that spelt still contains gluten and is not safe for anyone with celiac disease. To use it, look for whole spelt berries or stone-ground spelt flour, never the bleached kind. Substitute it cup for cup in any bread recipe, but add a bit less water.
Spelt drinks up liquid differently than modern wheat. Bake it a shade darker than you think it needs. The crust should sound hollow when you tap it. A grain resilient enough to survive a plague in Egypt, and today most people have never even said its name out loud.
Number 8. Fitches, the grain planted in rows nobody else bothered to plant carefully. Isaiah chapter 28, verses 25 through 27 describes a farmer scattering fitches and cumin, planting wheat in rows, barley in its place, and rye as the border of his field. Most translations render fitches as black cumin or nigella, a small dark seed used across the ancient Near East as both spice and grain extender. The passage is not decoration. Isaiah is using precise agricultural knowledge that different seeds require different planting depths and different threshing methods as a metaphor for God's wisdom. The farmer did not thresh fitches with a heavy sledge the way he threshed wheat. He beat them gently with a stick, because a heavy tool would crush the tiny seed to powder. Modern research on nigella seed, the most likely candidate for the fitches of Isaiah, has produced a striking body of evidence. A 2017 review published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology examined over 200 studies on the compound thymoquinone found concentrated in nigella seed and found consistent anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects across laboratory and animal models, along with several small human trials showing improved markers of blood sugar control. To use it, buy whole black nigella seeds, not the powder, which loses potency within weeks. Toast a teaspoon in a dry pan for 60 seconds until fragrant, then crush lightly with the back of a spoon. Sprinkle it over flatbread before baking, the way it has been used across the Levant for centuries. A little goes a long way. It is sharp, almost peppery, nothing like a bland seasoning. Isaiah used the correct threshing method for this seed as evidence of divine wisdom, and it still requires a gentler hand than any other grain on this list. Number 7. Roasted grain, the field ration that fed an army and a widow on the same afternoon. Ruth chapter 2, verse 14 records something easy to read past. Boaz invites Ruth to eat bread dipped in vinegar and hands her parched grain, roasted right there in the field, still warm. This was not a snack. Roasting grain in the husk over an open flame was the fastest way to make raw barley edible without a mill, a fire pit, or an oven, which made it the standard field ration for laborers, travelers, and soldiers who could not wait for bread to rise. The same food appears again in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 18, when Abigail loads 5 measures of parched grain onto donkeys as part of an emergency peace offering to David and his 600 armed men. It shows up a third time in 1 Samuel chapter 17, packed by Jesse for his sons on the front line against the Philistines. 3 separate moments, 3 separate crises, and the same solution every time. The science behind roasting whole grain is more interesting than it sounds. A 2019 study in the journal Food Chemistry found that dry roasting barley and wheat kernels increases the concentration of certain antioxidant compounds, including ferulic acid, while the Maillard reaction, the same browning reaction that gives roasted coffee and seared meat their depth, generates new flavor compounds without any added sugar. It is calorie-dense, shelf-stable for months without refrigeration, and requires zero equipment beyond a flat pan and a fire. To make it, buy whole hulled barley or wheat berries. Dry roast a half cup in a hot skillet for 6 to 8 minutes, shaking constantly so nothing burns. The kernels will pop slightly and turn golden.
Eat them straight from the pan, or crush them coarsely and stir them into yogurt or vegetables. This is not a recipe. It is a technique that outlasted 3 separate famines in Scripture. A field ration good enough for a king's army, and it costs less than a granola bar. Number 6. Manna, bread that fell from the sky and disappeared the moment anyone tried to hoard it. Exodus chapter 16 describes it with unusual botanical precision for an ancient text. It appeared each morning like frost on the ground, small and round, the color of coriander seed, and it tasted like wafers made with honey. The Israelites ground it in mills, or beat it in mortars, boiled it in pots, and made cakes of it.
When anyone tried to save it overnight against instruction, it bred worms and stank by morning, except on the 6th day, when a double portion kept perfectly for the Sabbath. Whatever the physical source of manna was, the account is unusually specific for a miracle story, and that specificity has drawn attention from food scientists studying tamarisk trees and lichens native to the Sinai. But the detail worth focusing on is the pattern itself.
Modern research on intermittent food scarcity and what nutritionists now call time-restricted eating has found something the Israelites lived by default. A body that receives a consistent amount of fuel on a consistent schedule regulates blood sugar and hunger signals more predictably than a body that gorges and hoards. A 2020 review in the New England Journal of Medicine summarized decades of research showing metabolic benefits tied to regular eating windows rather than constant, irregular grazing. There is no modern substitute you can buy for manna, but you can apply the principle behind it.
Prepare only what you will eat that day, especially with grain-based foods, which lose nutritional value and go stale within 24 hours of grinding. Fresh ground flour oxidizes fast. If you mill your own grain, use it the same day, the way manna was gathered fresh every single morning without exception. The Israelites could not stockpile it no matter how hard they tried, and maybe that was never a punishment. Maybe that was the instruction. Number 5. Unleavened bread. The loaf made in under 20 minutes because there was no time to wait. Exodus chapter 12, verse 39 explains it directly.
The Israelites left Egypt in such haste that they baked unleavened cakes of the dough they carried out, because they had no time to prepare food for themselves, let alone wait for it to rise. Unleavened bread, matzah, became the defining food of Passover, eaten to this day as a physical reminder of urgency and freedom rather than comfort. What most people miss is the practical genius hiding inside that urgency. Flatbread made from flour and water alone, without yeast or fermentation time, cooks in under 2 minutes on a hot surface, requires no oven, and can be made by a family with nothing but a fire and a flat stone.
A study on unleavened flatbreads, published in the Journal of Food Science and Technology, found that the rapid, high-heat cooking method preserves more of the grain's natural B vitamins than the slower baking process used for leavened loaves, because less time under heat means less vitamin degradation. To make it, mix 2 cups of whole wheat flour with a half teaspoon of salt and roughly 3/4 cup of water until it forms a firm dough. Do not let it rest. Divide it into golf ball-sized pieces, roll each one paper thin, and cook it on a dry, very hot skillet for 60 to 90 seconds per side until it bubbles and blisters. No yeast, no rising time, no waiting.
A bread born from an emergency, and it is still the fastest thing you can put in front of a hungry family tonight. Number 4. Showbread. The 12 loaves that sat in the presence of God and were eaten by nobody but the priests. Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 through 9 gives the exact instructions. 12 loaves, made from fine flour, arranged in 2 rows of 6 on a table of pure gold inside the tabernacle, replaced fresh every Sabbath. The old loaves were not thrown away. They belonged to Aaron and his sons, eaten in a holy place because Scripture calls it a thing most holy. 12 loaves for 12 tribes, standing continually before the Lord as a covenant that would never lapse.
This is the bread most churches today misunderstand entirely when they picture what the disciples broke at the Last Supper. That was Passover bread, unleavened, eaten once a year. Showbread was different, made weekly from the finest sifted flour in Israel, a national grain offering renewed without interruption for over 400 years inside the tabernacle and later the temple. The detail worth pulling out is the flour itself. Fine flour, or solet in Hebrew, meant flour sifted so thoroughly that the bran and germ were largely removed, leaving something closer to what we would now call refined flour.
Interestingly, a 2018 comparative study in the journal Foods found that while whole grain flour carries more fiber, extremely fine sifted flour ferments and digests differently, producing a softer crumb structure that stays edible for longer without refrigeration, which mattered enormously for bread meant to sit in a warm tabernacle for 7 days at a time. You cannot recreate showbread exactly. Its purpose was ceremonial, not nutritional, but you can bake with the same intention. Sift your flour twice before using it in any bread you make for a gathering or a holiday. The extra step changes the texture more than most people expect.
A loaf so sacred that only priests were permitted to eat it, and it stood on that table without interruption for longer than most modern nations have existed. Number 3. The leaven of the Pharisees, the smallest ingredient in Scripture used as the biggest warning. Matthew chapter 13, verse 33 records Jesus comparing the kingdom of heaven to leaven that a woman hid in 3 measures of meal until the whole was leavened. It is one of his gentler parables about growth. But in Matthew chapter 16, verse 6, he flips the same ingredient into a warning, telling his disciples to beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, meaning their teaching, spreading quietly through a community the same way yeast spreads through dough.
Leaven meant something very specific in the ancient world, a piece of old fermented dough saved from a previous batch and mixed into new dough to make it rise, essentially what modern bakers now call a sourdough starter. This is not a minor technical detail. It changes how the whole grain economy of the ancient world worked. Every household did not buy yeast. They kept a living culture alive for years, sometimes generations, passed from mother to daughter. Here is where modern science gets genuinely interesting.
A 2020 study published in the journal Microorganisms found that traditional long fermentation with a sourdough culture breaks down a significant portion of the gluten proteins and the compounds called FODMAPs in wheat flour before it is even baked, which is why some people with mild gluten sensitivity tolerate true sourdough bread when they cannot tolerate commercial yeast bread. The wild bacteria in a sourdough culture also lower the bread's glycemic index by producing lactic acid during fermentation, according to a study in the British Journal of Nutrition, meaning it raises blood sugar more slowly than bread made with commercial yeast.
To start your own, mix equal parts whole wheat flour and water in a jar, roughly 100 grams of each, and leave it uncovered at room temperature. Feed it the same amount of flour and water every 24 hours. By day 5 or 6, it should smell sour and show bubbles throughout, which means the wild yeast and bacteria have taken hold. That living culture is the same principle Jesus used twice in the same book, once as a picture of the kingdom growing quietly, once as a warning about what spreads just as quietly if you are not paying attention. The bread most churches serve today, the flat wafer, the small commercial cracker, is not the bread the disciples broke on the night of the Last Supper.
That bread was Passover matzah, but the fermentation principle behind ordinary daily bread ran through nearly every other meal Jesus ate, and it is quietly having a comeback in bakeries that finally caught up to what a sourdough culture was doing to gluten 2,000 years before anyone had a name for gluten sensitivity. Number 2, wheat. The grain the Bible calls the finest of the wheat, and the one every other grain on this list was compared against. Psalm 81 verse 16 describes God feeding his people with the finest of the wheat, and Psalm 147 verse 14 says he fills you with the finest of the wheat, using the same phrase both times as the highest possible standard for provision.
Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8 lists wheat first among the 7 species of the Promised Land, ahead of barley, ahead of the fig, ahead of the vine. Wheat in 1st century Israel bore almost no resemblance to what fills a modern grocery store bag labeled wheat flour.
Ancient wheat varieties, the einkorn and emmer strains cultivated across the region since roughly 9000 BC, according to archaeobotanical surveys from sites across the Fertile Crescent, contained roughly half the gluten protein content of the modern dwarf wheat varieties developed through intensive breeding programs in the 1950s and 60s, specifically to increase yield per acre.
That breeding program solved a real problem, global hunger, but it changed the protein structure of the grain that fed you your last sandwich. A 2013 study published in the British Journal of Nutrition compared ancient wheat varieties against modern commercial wheat and found the ancient strains carried significantly higher concentrations of lutein, a carotenoid linked to eye health, along with a more favorable ratio of amino acids. Researchers at the University of Bologna, running separate trials, found that participants with mild wheat sensitivity, not celiac disease, reported measurably less digestive discomfort eating bread made from ancient einkorn wheat compared to bread made from modern wheat, even when both breads contained gluten. To use it, look specifically for einkorn or emmer wheat flour, sold in most health food stores and increasingly by name online. It behaves differently than modern flour. It absorbs less water and produces a denser, nuttier loaf, so reduce your liquid by roughly 15% in any standard recipe. Do not overknead it. Ancient wheat gluten is more fragile and tears if handled the way modern bread dough is handled. The grain Scripture repeatedly calls the finest, and it is not the grain sitting in most kitchens today. Number 1. And this is the one that pulls every grain on this list into a single formula.
The bread Ezekiel was commanded to eat as a sign in front of his entire nation, and it may be the most nutritionally complete recipe written anywhere in Scripture. Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 9 through 17 is unlike anything else in the Bible. God tells the prophet to take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, put them into one vessel, and make bread of it. Not one grain, 6 ingredients, named individually, combined into a single loaf. Ezekiel was commanded to eat this bread daily in a rationed amount for 390 days, baking it over fuel made from cow dung after he protested the original instruction to use human waste, and God permitted the substitution. This was not a recipe for comfort.
It was a sign act, a piece of street theater performed in front of the exiled nation to show them what siege rationing would look like when Jerusalem finally fell, eating bread by careful weight and drinking water by careful measure, because there would not be enough of either. Here is why this single verse matters more than anyone realized for 1900 years. Wheat, barley, spelt, and millet are grains. Beans and lentils are legumes. Grains on their own are missing the amino acid lysine. Legumes on their own are missing the amino acids methionine and cysteine.
Combined in the same loaf, each one fills in exactly what the other is missing, producing what nutritionists now call a complete protein, containing all 9 essential amino acids the human body cannot manufacture on its own. A 2007 nutritional analysis published by researchers at Cornell University confirmed that a bread combining grains and legumes in roughly the proportions described in Ezekiel 4:9 delivers a significantly more complete amino acid profile than bread made from wheat alone, along with a meaningfully lower glycemic index because the legume fiber slows how quickly the bread's carbohydrates enter the bloodstream.
The formula is precise enough that a commercial bakery now produces sprouted bread built directly on this 6-ingredient combination, and it remains one of the most nutritionally dense breads sold in any grocery store in the country, nearly 2,600 years after a prophet was first commanded to eat it as a punishment. To make it, combine 2 cups whole wheat flour, 1 cup barley flour, a 1/4 cup each of dried lentils and dried beans ground into flour, a 1/4 cup millet flour, and a 1/4 cup spelt flour. Mix with a packet of active yeast, a tablespoon of honey, 2 tablespoons of oil, and roughly 1½ cups of warm water into a firm dough.
Knead for 10 minutes. Let it rise for 1 hour. Shape it and bake at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the crust is deep golden and sounds hollow when tapped. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a genuinely complete meal in loaf form, exactly the way it was designed to be 26 centuries before a nutrition label existed to explain why. Picture the room where this thread finally comes together. It is the night before the crucifixion, an upper room in Jerusalem, the smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs still in the air. Jesus takes bread, ordinary, unleavened Passover bread, breaks it, and says, "Take, eat. This is my body." He is not reaching for showbread from the temple or a loaf built from Ezekiel's 6-ingredient formula. He reaches for the plainest bread on the table, the same bread every family in that city was eating that same week, and turns it into the most repeated act of remembrance in human history. Bread, in Scripture, was never just food. It was survival during siege. It was covenant on a golden table. It was warning hidden inside a parable. And in that final room, it became memory itself. 10 grains and breads, and every one of them was written down centuries before anyone could explain in a laboratory why it worked. That is the part worth sitting with. This was never superstition dressed up as tradition. Ancient bakers did not have a microscope to identify gluten structure or a lab to isolate ferulic acid, but they understood, through thousands of years of trial, exactly which grains to combine, which ones to roast, which ones needed a gentle hand at the threshing floor. Industrial milling and mass production did not improve on that knowledge. It stripped it out for shelf life and cost, and called the result progress. One honest warning before you start any of this: not every ancient grain sold today is what it claims to be. Bags labeled ancient grain blend often contain mostly modern wheat with a small percentage of einkorn or spelt added for the label. Read the ingredient list, not the front of the bag. Whole grain flour that has been sitting on a shelf for over 6 months has already lost a meaningful percentage of its B vitamins to oxidation. So buy in smaller quantities and store it in the freezer if you are not using it within a few weeks. And if you are working toward a sourdough starter, patience matters more than temperature. Rushing the culture with extra yeast defeats the entire fermentation process that makes it easier to digest in the first place. Pick one grain from this list, just one, and make it this week. Roast a half cup of barley in a pan tonight, or start a sourdough culture on your counter tomorrow morning. You do not need all 10. People fed entire nations on this knowledge for thousands of years without a video explaining it to them first. You will be fine. Subscribe before you go, and as you think about which one of these you will actually try, share this video with the person in your life who still bakes bread the old way. They will recognize half of what is on this list already. Then drop your pick in the comments so I know which one to cover in depth next time.